Good morning to those of you if you're up very early in Australia watching this online or elsewhere in the world. We have a fantastic discussion planned for you this afternoon regarding carbon pricing and market-based instruments, including Article 6, as a key vehicle to facilitate private sector investments and drive climate action. And ahead of the global stocktake, which, as we know, is happening at COP28. This afternoon's public and private dialogue aims to explore the importance of expanding market-based carbon pricing instruments and international cooperation to mobilise finance flows, scale up reduction and removal activities and increase NDC ambition. I want to acknowledge and thank our co-organisers, IETA, the ICC as the focal point for business and industry, and the European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition for organising this afternoon's event and panellists. There will be some fantastic and diverse perspectives, I think, provided today in what promises to be a great discussion. We will convene this discussion against the backdrop of urgency, as we know, identified in the latest IPCC reports, and in the active stages of preparing for the global stocktake later this year in Dubai. And it's my pleasure to introduce you to some speakers that we have. To my right, Mbaye, you are not only a very busy man in all forums of Article 6, but the supervisory board member from Senegal. We also have Malek Al-Chalabi from Shell, the senior carbon pricing and advocacy advisor at Shell. Helen Bray, who is not, yes, Helen will be joining us in a moment, Vice President of Policy at Puro.earth. Welcome, thank you, Helen. Vladislav Malashevskyy, who is a member of YOUNGO, the official UNFCCC youth constituency. We're also pleased to have Eman Al-Suwaidi, who is the team leader of markets for the UAE COP28 presidency. Also, least but certainly not last, Axel Michaelawa, who is the senior founding partner of Perspectives Climate Group, and I did threaten Axel that I was going to introduce him as an encyclopedia of Article 6. So we're very excited to have all our guests with it. So our session today will begin with some scene setting, and sorry I missed introducing Hadji as well, who is a policy analyst with European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition. And Hadji, you're going to take us through some scene setting and introduce today's discussion, so I'll hand to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily, and welcome and good afternoon to everybody. I will be just setting some scene for the conversation, that is an interesting conversation that's going to go ahead. So without any further ado, the latest carbon pricing report that was released by World Bank, it was highlighted that the carbon taxes and emission trading system has grown from 7% to 23%. And as we see, they are expanding and the role is very important. And the governments which are not yet have implemented carbon markets, they are looking further to implementing in future, as it is an important, important measure for countries to achieve their goals. Just a brief summary, but I won't go into detail. What entails in the carbon market, they're basically compliance markets, voluntary offsets, and compliance offsets. Starting off with the role of voluntary carbon markets, the current state of play. As we know, the role of voluntary carbon markets is mostly associated with the private sector, companies and corporates that are looking for emission reductions in their whole value chain. The size of market is expected to expand and reach up to 10 billion to 40 billion by 2030. And as we have seen around the negotiations, Article 6, there have been concerns around what is the role of VCM, and it is highly linked to Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. However, this has not restricted the community to go ahead and progress in terms of development. And as we have seen in terms of Integrity Council of Voluntary Carbon Markets and the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative. However, there is a very strong need of quality credits that we can have in the market through the voluntary carbon in order to gain some confidence in the private sector. Then there's also the role of the Article 6.4 mitigation contribution units, which have been in the talks recently. Now, just to see how the private sector is involved in the whole process, they are involved in the form of registries, they are developers and brokers and buyers. So all of these all of these have a huge role to play when it comes to evolution of new international carbon markets as well. Coming to Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, as it's been 6 years now that the negotiations around Article 6 have been going on, and much further before that. But the importance is quite highlighted that it will help in implementation of international carbon markets. It will help in linking of different ETS systems that are operating in silos right now. And also, it has the potential for carbon markets for parties and multilateral international organizations, and also the private sector in achieving their climate goals. In a survey done by the Ministry of Environment, Japan, and IGS, out of 194 Paris signatories, 110 have expressed interest in Article 6, which has the potential to reduce up to 4 to 12 billion tons of CO2 emissions per year and mobilize around 220 billion USD in finance by 2030. Again, I won't go into details, but this is just a highlight of what are the outcomes at COP27 when it comes to Article 6.2, and what are we currently discussing in Bonn and looking forward to discussing in COP28 in Dubai. And same goes for Article 6.4. Now, one of the key issues that we have been seeing evolving, the economic benefits of Article 6 have also been highlighted. As we see, there's been $250 billion saving in a year by 2030, as I've already highlighted. This is a study done by IETA. And also reduction of 5 gigaton of CO2 equivalent per year by 2030. And lastly, it also leads to up to 1 trillion in international finance flow up to 2050. Now, understanding the role of CCUS in Paris Agreement, SB has been, Article 6.4 supervisory body has been dealing with removals. Currently, there is no market for removals, but the importance has been highlighted in a lot of reports, including the IPCC 6th assessment report and the IEA Net Zero report by 2050. However, net zero has been achieved. It's up to the countries how they design these policies, and there has to be a balanced approach between the measures that are being taken and the national surroundings. And until recently, CCUS and removal technologies have not benefited from the same technical and political support as many technologies we have seen evolving. Like the recent developments in EU have been noted in terms of like certification framework for carbon removals. However, there is no international stance right now. My last slide is just, as you can see in the diagram, there are so many carbon markets that are operating and ETS systems that are operating in silos. And more further, there are going to be new ones, new market mechanisms such as Article 6 and ICAO's CORSIA. How do we assess the impact and level of effort of all of these carbon markets together is something that we have to look into. However, we see there is no direct linkage with GST of Article 6, but there are a lot of indirect linkages through NDCs and countries taking up, ratcheting up mechanism, which will positively increase in the level of effort for countries. So I will bring back to you, Emily, and looking forward to an interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sachi. Now, unfortunately, because he is a man who is in high demand, I'm going to hand to Mbaye to give us your perspectives, Mbaye, on carbon markets and in particular Article 6 and linking with the broader COP28 agenda on the global stock take, including scaling of mitigation and finance activities. Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, colleagues. Good evening. When it comes to the private sector, the carbon market, and the GST, we need to recognize that for this first GST, the elements that can be tabled and discussed around the role of the private sector as well as the carbon market will be based on the previous experience and the ongoing experience of the private sector when it comes to its contribution in the carbon market. Because under the Paris Agreement, and the GST is related to the Paris Agreement, we have the Article 6 dealing with carbon markets. And that Article 6 is not still operational. So the only elements that can be tabled now at this point to be included in this GST as input at the theoretical level based on credible experience already conducted by the private sector will be to how we can assess the contribution of the private sector as well as the market in the future, in the incoming GST, the second one. Because as I said, the Article 6 is not operational, but we already know under the Paris Agreement that is the only legal instrument under which the UNFCCC clearly recognizes the role of the non-state actors and invite them to enhance and to amplify their action. That's a very clear statement under the Paris Agreement itself. And the private sector and many actors may do so through the carbon market, meaning the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And we think so that the Article 6 may be one of the drivers to the contribution of the private sector in these Paris Agreement objectives. And we have seen that already in a member, as you said, of the 6.4 supervisory body, but we already agreed under the Article 6 to provide some flexibility. And it's why under the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and mainly the 6.4, which is the UNFCCC mechanism, we have two types of units. Units with corresponding adjustment, with share of proceed, with contribution to adaptation, contribution to mitigation with OMG, overall mitigation in global emission, that is already contribution to both mitigation and adaptation. And we have also what we called mitigation contribution units. We have two different type of units to be able to participate in many objectives when it comes to the private sector and the usage. So meaning units coming from this mechanism can be used by companies in meeting their corporate social responsibilities. We have seen also that some emerging new markets, as Corsia, the aviation market, clearly stated, put on place that market, that will be very important, and have already accredited many standards, but clearly saying when the units that I will use will be subject to corresponding adjustment. So meaning those units cannot be used by anyone to meet its legal contribution. And that means those units will be cancelled and only the atmosphere will benefit and the objective of the Paris Agreement will be in line with that. And lastly, we have seen also that all the voluntary standards, now they call themselves independent standards, like Vera, like Gold Standard, and all of them, are aligning their rules on Article 6, meaning they will provide also units with corresponding adjustment as well as units without corresponding adjustment to have a very large spectrum of usage of that. That means we will have a very large possibility of use of units coming from different standards for different objectives. And at the same time, many countries have already set up in their contribution, their national contributions, that they will meet their objective by using the carbon market, involving their private sector in their company, and also having this international transfer of mitigation outcome from country to country. It's already stated by, in many countries, commitment, NDC. In developing countries also, we have seen that many of them have two types of NDC. In the same submission, they have, in the mitigation part, they have an NDC which is unconditional and a conditional one. And the conditional one is linked to receiving finance coming from outside those countries. For example, in Senegal, when I see the mitigation contribution, it's around 70% by 2030, emission reduction compared to baseline, business as usual scenario. But when it comes to the conditional one, it's 32 or something like that. Very huge difference. And Senegal has already stated that they will use both the carbon pricing instruments, meaning the carbon tax, but also the carbon market to meet those conditional, and many countries have done so. And that means already buying as well as potential selling countries have put on place a very huge potential of transaction and the involvement of private sector as well as any other company in those areas. And also the Corsia has done same. So we think what we need in line with the GST is already, and IETA has already conducted some modeling studies in relation to that to define the model and how that assessment may be done in terms of adaptation, in terms of mitigation, in terms of amplification of the saving coming from this carbon market in enhancing the ambition, that all of that can be already be prepared to be put on table as a technical and scientific input in the GST on how we can assess the role of the private sector as well as the one of the carbon market in contributing to the global objective of the Paris Agreement. That are just some thoughts I have, and saying that all the standards as well the Article 6 and the countries are pushing for having more involvement of the private sector, and that may be done through this carbon market, both on compliance as well as for voluntary one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mbaye. Forgot to put my...
questions and all of that.
Yes, we might take questions if that's all right now, given that you do need to go, and then we'll open up to our other panellists. Are there any questions, just very quickly? We'll probably just take one or two for Mbaye, but otherwise we'll free you back to do all the many other things that you do. But are there any questions at this stage?
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. And while Helen joins us up here on the panel, I might now throw it open to some of our panellists in terms of commenting on the role of carbon pricing and carbon markets more generally in driving climate action ahead of the GST, which, as you all know, we have a goods and services tax in Australia, and so every time I hear the word GST, I think of whether or not I need to pay it rather than the global stock take. but we are talking about the global stock take in this context. So, Malek, I might throw to you first in terms of your perspectives from a business and private sector perspective on how markets and pricing enable the shift and the transition and the scaling for implementation and scaling considerations for markets in the context of the global stock take. So I'll throw to you and then open to our other panellists. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. Thanks for the opportunity to comment. It's good to see many friends on the panel and in the audience. I think from our perspective, we've got three main points that I wanted to highlight. I think the first one is when we look at the science, it's clear that carbon dioxide removals are needed in any net zero emissions pathway, whether that's the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or our energy security scenarios that we published earlier this year. And so we see the importance of carbon dioxide removals whether engineered or natural, and they are a key part of reaching net zero. And so from a science perspective, that's one of the key elements that we see. I think that leads me to the second point, which is that not all countries will have the same carbon sequestration capacity, whether engineered or natural. And I think one thing to highlight is I published a blog post with our chief climate change advisor, David Hone, last week, highlighting this very point, that if we look at the history of economic growth, there have been multiple examples of trade hubs, whether in textiles or in medicine or in automobiles, and carbon will be the next revolution. And so based on that, we see trade being a key part of carbon, given the diversification of carbon sequestration potential across geographies. It's a point that we've highlighted in our latest energy security scenarios, but also in one of our publications called the Singapore Sketch. And there we evaluate how a country like Singapore could reach net zero, where it has industrial activity, a history of trade, and there we see Singapore becoming a key trade hub. And one of the main points that I hear in the negotiation room is some countries want to achieve net zero, and then any excess credits could be traded. But if we look at some of the work that IETA has done, trade will help enable that as a cost-effective mechanism. That's key. And I think that then brings me to the third point, which is how do we operationalize this? And I think when we look at carbon pricing, it is part of a broader policy framework that in isolation won't work. And the International Chamber of Commerce has done a tremendous amount of work looking at their carbon pricing principles launched at COP26, and also the business review of carbon pricing launched at COP27. And there's some key elements that look at how carbon pricing can help governments achieve their net zero targets, how it can achieve to be part of a broader policy framework, and how it can be a key part of revenue generation. And I think if we take a step back, in the 1990s, the amount of carbon emissions priced was single digits. And today we've achieved around 25%. So that shows a tremendous amount of growth in that space. But what that also means is that 75% of emissions are still unpriced. And if you ask some of our friends, they'll tell you that of the 25% of the emissions that are priced, a small fraction of that is at the price needed to drive low carbon abatement technologies. And so there's a lot more work to be done in this space. Earlier this month, we've published a podcast on the Energy Podcast looking at how can carbon markets help achieve climate change. And one of the key messages there is to put a price on carbon. And so we believe from a private sector perspective that there's a role for us to play. We see that message coming out from IETA, the International Chamber of Commerce, and many others. And it was very encouraging to hear Mbaye on the supervisory body also reinforce this message. And so for us, it's the need for carbon dioxide removals is key. Not all countries will have the same sequestration capacity, which opens up the need for trade. And this can be enabled as part of a broader policy framework to include carbon pricing.
Thank you very much for those comments. I think they certainly do build on Mbaye's comments as well. Vladislav, I might bring you in here in terms of YOUNGO, and you've watched the Article 6 negotiations with interest over the last several years. What are some of the perspectives, your own and youth, on markets and scaling, as well as how they can be effective in driving some of the GST and potentially some of the design issues, but I'll also come back to you about that later. But what are some of your perspectives that you might want to share?
Okay, yep, sorry. So in general, we think that carbon markets shouldn't be demonized. Many times we have like two different poles where either it's a good thing, very useful, or it's something to be completely avoided. But actually it's just a tool which we want to use to achieve something. If we think about the Paris Agreement, we have nationally determined contributions which are national. So we have something that is based on national laws and perspectives and commitments. But on the other hand, we have a global problem. We have the climate crisis, which is defined as being a global concern and something that we have to address commonly. So we must find a bridge between these two things where we have a global problem and national commitments. And this tool to collaborate between different entities can be those carbon markets in the sense, in particular, because Article 6 is the article for cooperation approaches and international cooperation rather than simply carbon markets. So if we approach this from the perspective that carbon markets are a tool rather than the objective in se, so rather than something to look at them just because they are there, we can see that if we define correctly the rules of these carbon markets, they can actually deliver on their mandate to move these emissions, emission reduction between countries, and therefore bring us closer to Paris Agreement, the Paris Agreement goals. So I think that when we approach this issue on what to do with carbon markets, we have to really keep this in mind. Otherwise, we can go out of track and just look at, of course, prices, etc., on the different market mechanism, but only from the market perspective, which is not the goal of carbon markets. And especially for this reason, and I will conclude maybe deep dive a bit on a second question, definitions are really important because we have, we have to have a common nomenclature and know what we are talking about. We have to have strict definitions on the topics we are talking about so that there is no misunderstanding between countries on definitions of what we are trading, what we are moving around, also for the private sector, for civil society, etc. So that it is clear and it brings us all closer to the Paris Agreement goals. This is the general approach I think we have.
Thank you very much. That's very, very, very brave of you to raise common nomenclature. I'm going to stumble over it now. I think of the term as some of our negotiators did the other day. Helen, I'm going to bring you in. You work with one of the world's leading crediting platforms for engineered carbon removals, which is a very popular topic at the moment. I'd like you to elaborate on that. I mean, there has been a lot of discussion about removals, both in the context of Article 6.4, but also in the context of the EU carbon removal certification framework. Where do you see the role of removals in carbon markets, and why are they important to increase ambition towards net zero?
Thank you, Emily, and thank you, IETA, ICC, and ERCST. It's great to be here, and I think maybe I need to do a bit of level setting about what Puro.earth is. I know you've explained it, but we were set up 4 years ago because no one else was doing what we were doing, and we credit what we call durable carbon removal. We don't tend to call it engineering anymore, purely because there's nature in the processes that we look at. We look at biochar, enhanced rock weathering, bioenergy carbon capture and storage, direct air carbon capture and storage, mineralization, and looking towards the ocean environment. So, and going back to the point about definitions, in some worlds we're called an independent standard, in other worlds we're called a carbon crediting program, and in the EU we're called a certification scheme. So we would really welcome being able to call ourselves one thing in different markets. Please help me here. And all the projects, the suppliers that we work with, because we issue the credits, we publish them in the registry, they are independently verified, and this was very important to us when we set up Puro. It's about bringing integrity and transparency to carbon markets. So I think Malek's already set the reason for why we need removals. You know, I was just looking at the numbers in the IPCC report last night. If you look at the methodologies that we certify on the lower range, it's about 8 gigatons per year by 2050. Currently, for the methods that we certify, we're at 2 million tons. So you can see the range of growth that's needed. Having said that, emissions reductions need to happen. This is not about business as usual. It's not about keeping the same mix that we have now. So moving on to carbon markets, we tend to operate more in voluntary carbon markets purely because there aren't compliance carbon markets. The only one that's available for direct air capture into storage is the Californian Low Carbon Fuel Standard. We'd love more compliance markets to be open. And the types of corporations that buy our credits, we call them CORCs, the carbon carbon dioxide removal certificates, CORCs, are people like Boston Consulting Group, JP Morgan, Microsoft, Shopify, Klarna, and there's a number of advanced market commitments like the Frontier Fund and NextGen who have pre-purchased CORCs. So both voluntary and compliance carbon markets are important. We're waiting for more information from the Integrity Council on their CCPs, the core carbon credits, and we're also looking at what's coming out of the VCMI, the Integrity Initiative on the demand side, the claims use of practice, and we're also looking at what's coming out of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, the 3 I's we call them. So there's a lot of movement this year, and what we need to be able to build confidence in this is those clear standards to come out and for us to be able to adopt them. We welcome that. It would help with this whole issue around where is the role for removals. I think, as a final point, if governments do want to put removals, and I'm talking here about all removals, though we focus on the durable removals, if they want to put them into compliance markets, we welcome that discussion. You know, how are emissions trading systems designed to deliver net zero, not zero emissions? And what are those safeguards? I think I heard some comments down there that it's important to have safeguards when you're designing things, because this is ultimately about the outcome, the impact on the atmosphere, and it needs to be designed really, really well in order for that net zero to be delivered. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen, for those comments and the challenges you face with your various operating environments. Axel, I'm going to bring you in. We're in the active preparation stages at the moment for the GST, and so really interested in your perspectives on the role of carbon pricing and carbon markets more generally in driving action in this active preparation stage and ahead of the GST at the end of the year.
Yeah, thank you very much. And of course, this global stocktake will have these 2 components. There's the backward-looking component, so what have we achieved in the past, and the forward-looking component. I'll first look into the backward-looking. So we have had real success in international carbon markets. Look at the clean development mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol. Now everyone says, that's a dead mechanism. But I was engaged in the research world before the CDM took its upswing, and one was thinking, maybe 50 projects a year. If everything goes very well, 100 projects a year. We got thousands of projects per year, and we got 2 billion credits, and we got an unprecedented action on the private sector side. If you read business newspapers in India in the mid-2000s, every day there would be an article about carbon credits, CDM, and how it mobilizes Indian industry. And I was really extremely surprised how well private sector can engage in mitigation if the incentive structure is right. So I think it showed that an international carbon market with transparency, with international oversight, can play a crucial role. Of course, the CDM also told us what does not work on international carbon markets. We had additionality challenges, we had NGOs chasing developers through the roads, we had the EU prohibiting the use of industrial gas credits, and suddenly nobody liked the CDM anymore, and the EU still doesn't like international offsets. So these lessons need to be taken into account. And also the lesson that now these industrial gas projects, which were so strongly criticized by the NGOs, once a CDM incentive was not there anymore, they switched off their abatement equipment and they are emitting now and nobody cares. So international carbon markets do work. We know it, but they need to have the correct regulatory scheme, and often well-meant criticism can lead to unexpected outcomes. Now, with regard to the forward-looking aspect. So what do we want in the future from international carbon markets? And now, of course, the COP decisions on Article 6 clearly say the market shall contribute to ambition. So it's no longer a zero-sum game. No longer just an offset. So how can we, as carbon market developers and researchers, show that carbon market actually contribute to that ambition? How can we show that carbon markets deliver financing for the conditional part of the NDCs? We all know that the conditional parts of the NDCs can't be mobilized just through public international climate finance. It will not be sufficient. So we will need carbon markets for that. Then, of course, and I like IETA's motto, I is for integrity. We need 3 I's. We don't need just 1 I. The integrity is the crucial aspect. We've seen it in the past and we are already seeing it right now. Once integrity is put into doubt, like we see on the voluntary carbon market with the forestry credits in the last couple of months, the market will wither away because nobody will buy a commodity that is not a real commodity, but a created commodity, unless it is fully credible. And that's why we now need to show in the future that we can isolate the compliance markets from the problems of carbon cowboys on the voluntary carbon markets, how we can ensure that governments set the right guardrails for the voluntary carbon market in order that we don't see now a meltdown of the whole carbon market that cannot be remedied in the next decade. And hopefully we'll also see a bit of a faster pace of the Article 6.4 regulatory infrastructure to actually get to grips with its regulatory function. And of course, the fights in the 6.4 supervisory body on methodology principles, on additionality, they, of course, repeat fights we've seen in the past under the Kyoto mechanisms. And we personally, at Perspectives, we have proposed approaches to reconcile the need to be pragmatic, for example, to enable utilization of the CDM methodologies, but bringing in the new principles of Article 6 through Article 6 methodology tools. But for example, the debate in the supervisory body on what we call ambition coefficient, which is there called a baseline correction factor or contraction factor or whatever. This fight shows that many still have not realized that if we can't show properly that the markets contribute to ambition, that they have 100% integrity, the markets will die away a second time. And I've lived through the CDM crisis. I don't want to live through a new Article 6 crisis, VCM crisis whatsoever. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Axel. I think that is a fantastic segue into the next question that I was going to ask, which elaborates on your points, as well as Vladislav's observations and some of Helen's as well, which is looking, I think, both at the Paris Agreement Article 6 as well as carbon markets more generally, and this will be a question that I'll call on all of you, each of you, to answer. If we focus on providing a perspective on each of those, so Article 6 and carbon markets more broadly, what are some of the critical design issues, and I know, Axel, you've outlined some there, that you're seeing and that need to be addressed in order to achieve that, that multiple I integrity? And we might start, Malek, with you, if that's all right. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. So I think if I start with Article 6, one of the privileges I have is being the co-chair of the International Working Group. And there's 2 points I want to highlight. I think the first one is Article 6 is very technical and it's very complex. And so what IETA has done really well is starting to visualize some of the key developments that have taken place. And so there's a tracker that looks at the number of MOUs that have been signed, which countries have signed it, and what project scope. And I think once we take a look from all the text and you visually see the number of MOUs growing, the number of pilots growing, the scope growing, I think it helps illustrate the interest in that space. And I think that's a key contributor to helping visualize the developments. And the reason that's important is because when we look at Article 6, there's a lot that the private sector can deliver. And there's a paper that our 300-strong member group wrote called How Governments Can Help Operationalize Article 6 to Maximize the Role of the Private Sector. And there we talk about a half dozen key policy principles, which include, but are not limited to, articulate how Article 6 can help the country achieve its NDC, articulate what the strategy is and which sectors are and are not in scope. We also talk about how to address legal risks and how they can be managed, and that's something we've heard a lot about today in the negotiation rooms and throughout the week, but also capacity building. And that's another theme that even this morning was a key feature at another side event. And so for us, we think that these are some of the key policy principles that can help operationalize Article 6 and the private sector can engage in. And so those are some of the key points that we focus on Article 6 points. If I pivot to compliance markets, as I highlighted earlier, only 25% of emissions are priced. And if I look at some of the work that the International Chamber of Commerce has done, what they call for is if you don't have a price on carbon, start small. And you've seen that take place with other compliance-based mechanisms that eventually grow their scope and manage it accordingly. And we feel that given the importance of policy developments taking place and the ability for revenue recycling and revenue regeneration for low carbon and zero carbon technologies, there's a key role to continue to advocate for that in the compliance market. And so those are some of the key reflections that we have in terms of how to continue to operationalize Article 6 to maximize the role of the private sector, and also to continue to advocate for growth in carbon markets by putting a price on carbon.
Thank you very much, Malek. I think, Helen, we might hear from you on some of the design challenges that you see to maintain integrity or build integrity, and to sort of capture the concept that I think Axel described well about what can be achieved when we have a good design. Yeah. So looking both at carbon markets broadly, but also the Paris Agreement.
I think we need to take a step back, because a lot of this is about license to operate. And so it's very important that governments need to determine, and the language here we sometimes use is what is residual emissions. What is that? What are those residual emissions, maybe from transport or industry, that will need to be balanced out by durable carbon removals? And governments need to decide what role they want for durable carbon removals, and then how they want that to enable that. And I think with any market, you're going to need to have that first, rather than if you dive straight into you must have removals in compliant carbon markets, you haven't explained why you need to have this in the first place. This is about net zero. It's not an 80% reduction target anymore, or 90%, it's net zero. So you need that role there. So for governments to state that clearly in national plans, we would really welcome that. And then obviously any carbon market will need high integrity certification. It needs to be independently verified. It needs to be based on science-based methodologies. These are all things that we do at Puro. And carbon markets can give that long-term incentive, but initially for some of these projects, there'll be a range of policy measures. It won't just be carbon markets, and I think we've heard that from a number of panelists. And then looking to what we've been discussing this week, Article 6.2, Article 6.4, we don't know how these markets will play out. We're seeing the Article 6.2, the visualization that Malek spoke about on IETA's webpage is fantastic. Really helps you to see what's happening there. But what we would like to see is that both 6.2 and 6.4 are open to all forms of durable carbon removal. And then now we start that discussion on what are those specific safeguards that are needed to give license to operate to those types of technologies within those markets. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Helen. I think licence is an incredibly useful way of looking at integrity also. So thank you for those remarks. Vladislav, I'll bring you back in at this point. I know you did comment before on some design elements, but looking both broadly at carbon markets and Paris Agreement Article 6, what sorts of design, what are you seeing and what do you think needs to be there in order to sort of achieve and maintain the integrity that's required?
Yeah, so for sure I think that in general it's needed to have some sort of flexibility so that eventually if there are points not working correctly or as expected under Article 6, they may be changed or correcting even after Article 6 is made operational. So, for example, we saw that under the CDM, as other panelists said before me, it was a mechanism that was expected to work correctly, but at some point something didn't work out as expected. It may happen. Even if we try to do the best rules as possible under Article 6, it is still possible that something doesn't get considered or that there are some loopholes, or we know that Article 6 is extremely technical, and so it may be possible that something won't be decided probably as it should. So we must have some mechanism inside this article to make it changeable on even after it gets operationalized. On the other hand, this flexibility doesn't have to move into a lack of predictability and making the market unreliable, because of course if we have a market mechanism which we can count on because it may change from a day to another, it can create problems for who's interested in the market. So we have to find this, let's say, aura mediocritas in the between the two things, so be able to change, but at the same time not through shocks to the market. So this is one side. On the other side, I think that much has been said, for example, in Glasgow about agreements mechanism. This is a more specific thing, but we saw that under the CDM there were projects that some of them eventually were even environmental friendly, let's say, but they hurt communities, indigenous communities, or in general had bad impacts on social aspects. And there was no real direct way to complain about this. During the COP in Glasgow, at the end, some words were put inside the agreement to have some sort of grievance mechanism. We still don't know what it will look like and how it will work, but we definitely need it to be cleared so that we know how eventual communities or different civil society actors can apply for this grievance mechanism, because at the moment the text is quite general and not even so strong. We just have a general address not to have to lower as much as possible the negative impacts of eventual projects, which is of course not enough because this has to be defined. So probably this at least these two key points. Of course, there would be many more, like on terminology, etc. But I think there's not much time to discuss them here. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Vladislav. I think you've hit on a key tension that sort of underpins the multilateral process around continuous improvement and change and balancing various perspectives on those things, but the need to find a way through, which I think I agree, it's certainly continuous improvement is something we all need to strive for. Axel, before I bring the audience in, I might come back to you. I mean, you had some original perspectives on good design, but ask if you want to elaborate on any of those. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So one critical aspect, of course, that has contributed to the recent crisis in the voluntary carbon market is the question of the revenue models of the private carbon market programs. If, of course, a private carbon market program is financed according to the number of credits it issues, it has an inbuilt incentive to overestimate baselines and to cut corners. So we should find new models of funding these programs and standards that are not linked to credit quantity. We also need to prevent perverse incentives in the auditing, so for the validation and verification, that we don't have a process where these companies try to get new contracts from the same activity developer because they validate and verify leniently. But there could be a kind of model like we see in many health insurance systems around the world, that there is an allocation of a service provider according to a certain fee schedule randomly. So their validator and verifier has no incentive to please the company that it is to validate or verify. And of course also, if that can be achieved, then of course we would need now new trust among the buyers of the credits on the government side to act like the EU did under the CDM, the linking directive. That was the key driver of the CDM success, that you could use the CERs, the credits from the CDM, in the European trading scheme. And likewise, we would now need the possibility to use ITMOs against domestic carbon pricing schemes. And interestingly, the developing countries here are trailblazers: Colombia, South Africa, Chile. These countries allow it. Why don't the industrialized countries allow it? And especially also as now there are the debates about the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Why not consider allowing the use of credits instead of paying a carbon border adjustment tax? So these are some considerations.
Thank you very much, Axel. I think they've given us a lot of food for thought and hopefully stimulating some questions. So we have around 15 minutes now for questions from the audience, and I think, can anyone see the online questions if they come through? I'm not sure. I'm assuming that people online can ask questions, but we'll take any questions in the room. Probably time for 2 or 3, and we'll direct them. Please direct them to a panellist if you'd like a particular panellist to elaborate. Yes, the gentleman in the yes. We're running. If you either or I can repeat the question to the best of my ability, but feel free to. Oh, yeah. There's a microphone coming.
Walking myself and not feel as guilty. So hi, my name is Anton Tsvetov. I used to be an Article 6 negotiator, and now I consult on carbon markets representing the International Comparative Law Research Center here. So my question is on the linkage between 6.4 and the voluntary market. We have this saying in these carbon markets rooms that 6.4, Article 6 in general, but 6.4 more specifically, is going to be a lodestar or a gold standard for the rest of the market. And with all of the discussions that were mentioned today happening in the supervisory body and the issues around the baseline contraction factor and other elements of the METH guidance that Axel was mentioning, I'd ask the panelists to theorize a little bit on what happens to the voluntary market if the 6.4 mechanism turns out to be a highly stringent mechanism. That is, I mean, SOP, OMG, registration fees, all of that is there. The baseline contraction factor is very strict, and all the other element makes this a very, very stringent market. Now, does that, and limiting demand, supply basically, does that help the voluntary market to grow as an alternative to that one, or does it create the incentive for the VCM to sort of live up to those standards? So what would be the implications of a very robust 6.4 mechanism? So that would be my question. I'm looking at Axel. I see he has a response, but I would invite anyone to chip in. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We might, I'll ask panellists to keep remarks as brief as they can while answering the question. Is there anyone who wants to take that first? I did see you making some notes also, Axel, but anyone else want to come in? Yep, okay, so Axel and then Helen. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Anton, for this highly relevant question. And if I see, of course, the negotiations, I wonder whether 6.4 will really be able to achieve this aim. I fear not. But if it were, then, of course, now the question would be, yeah, would the demand side be willing to pay a premium for the mitigation contribution from 6.4, which are specifically meant for the voluntary market? Or would the voluntary market say, no, this is too expensive. We like to continue with the standards that are out there and we don't align to the 6.4 principles. So there would be the two-tier market. I don't know how the companies who currently buy voluntary credits would behave. I would hope that we have a convergence to the high standard and not a twin market of very separate standards. But yeah, it's too early to tell. I would expect with the current wave of litigation against companies making claims on the basis of offset credits, we would probably be moved towards the lodestar.
Thank you very much. Axel, Helen.
Thank you, Anton, for the question. I think it's one we're often asked, is it 6.2, which is more government-to-government trade, or will it be 6.4, which will dominate the most? Will the voluntary carbon markets exist? I wish I knew the answer, because then I could probably go and become a trader and do something else with my life. But back to your point, which was, is a robust Article 6.4 mechanism, can we give it a better name as well? Because that's not helping either. Is that a good thing? And ultimately, robust, high-integrity carbon markets are a good thing because this is about the carbon budget. So I would like to say and make an exciting response. Yes, that's a good thing. How will that impact on 6.2 and the voluntary carbon market? Well, they're all interlinked, and I think we saw in the slides at the beginning of the session, and Axel mentioned it, there's a number of compliance carbon markets that already take in voluntary carbon markets. And so we have this long discussion. Is it a compliance market? Is it a voluntary market? Is it an integrated market? It's all part of one big system. So, strive for a good, robust 6.4, which is usable. 6.2 is obviously already working. Grow that, and then let's see how the voluntary carbon market fits in. The whole point of Article 6, going back to first principles, is about international cooperation. That's the point of it, and that is a good intent, and it's about achieving net zero. So a bit animated there at the end, but thank you.
No, thank you. Does anyone else want to come in on that question? Yeah, Malek.
Yeah, I think just to add what Axel and Helen mentioned, I think indeed it's early days. In our Shell BCG report on the outlook of the voluntary carbon markets, we think it's 1 to 3 years before 6.4 becomes operational. And so I think to theorize, how that would then interplay once it's operational is as like my colleagues have said, a bit early. But I think our key point is that, as Helen said, the compliance market has its role, the voluntary market has its role, and Article 6 should continue to grow. And at the moment, the more growth in that space, the better. And eventually how they integrate is something to watch, but being that it's early days, it's something that we support growth in.
Thank you. Did you want to come in, Vladislav, or? Yep.
No, actually, quite aligned with Axel, and I just hope that when Article 6.4 will be there, and if it will be a golden standard, then hopefully companies like Shell and many others will align to the higher standards rather than eventually not so strong voluntary carbon market. So we'll see, but I think that no one has the real prediction what will happen.
Anton, I hope that helps. Early days is the is the sum, I think. Were there any other questions from the floor? We've probably got time for certainly another one and maybe two. Yeah, we've got one up the back and then, yep. Okay.
Hi, thank you. I'm Claire Fyson from Climate Analytics. I was just wondering if you have thoughts on how carbon removal credits can adequately capture the life cycle, like real net removal effects of, for example, BECS, especially where you have, you know, cross-border supply chains and things like that. So I'd be interested in that, and maybe also quickly on how we can ensure that a carbon market for removals would not detract from the urgent emissions reductions that we need. And maybe quick comment, I really hope we don't need 8 gigatons of removals in 2050. A lot of scenarios use less than that, and I hope we can end up in that world. Thanks.
Thank you. So there was a couple of little questions in there, I think, because removals were mentioned. Helen, I'm going to throw to you if you're comfortable. Yeah.
So I think when you look at designing, so compliance carbon markets have a cap on emissions. This gives you a defined outcome for the environment. This is a good thing. This is a good thing of carbon markets. So if you're going to be looking at putting in, and I would say here it needs to be permanent carbon removal, you need to ultimately change how that cap is, because you can't just put it in straight away, because it then affects the impact on the environment. So whenever you're looking at designing it, there's a great paper from the International Carbon Action Partnership, ICAP. They've looked at different ways of potentially linking removals with carbon markets and some of the considerations you need to have. And we know that discussion is starting to happen in the EU because of a requirement to look at that by the middle of 2026. So I think, you know, look at the cap changes, look at the type of removals you're putting in, look also at, you know, other safeguards around the volume that you would let in as well. And then maybe, you know, as we've done with carbon markets in the past, there's a kind of a learning by doing phase. So you might want to have a pilot phase, and you might also want to have a way of separating it rather than just automatically linking it, because we are cautious of what happened with international offsets. So I think all these elements need to be unpacked a bit more. And I can't remember the other two questions. I think there was a question there around looking at how you quantify removals. And I think it's a really important point that you need to look at the life cycles. You need to look at all the emissions that come from the processes going in, and you need to make sure you know that it's stored and it's done correctly. Because basically what you want to do is a good removal. You don't want bad removals. It needs to be done, quantified really robustly, and all our independently verified methodologies have robust quantification formula that take into consideration all the other emissions that might be going into that process. Thank you.
Thank you. Axel.
Yeah, I think the elephant in the room of removals, of course, is permanence. We know certain approaches are intrinsically more permanent than others, but of course, even those need to be monitored. I wonder how we will be able to monitor for the 100 years that would be necessary to really have the removals as a good part of the carbon markets. And we know that human institutions usually last much less than 100 years. So at what point in time, for example, if the company has been merged and again merged and or is going bankrupt, how are the processes to take responsibility organized? I think under the CDM, we had already some good precedent for the CCS guidelines that were never applied because nobody ever submitted a methodology. But I think the process in there was quite good. But I think we need to do much, much more to really ensure that the removal, the permanence is guaranteed. Because, of course, the easiest answer would be temporary crediting, but that didn't fly under the CDM. Nobody wanted the temporary credits. Buffer stocks, we need to see the pros and cons. We see that some of the buffer stocks in the sub-national markets are already being used up, California, for example. So there is no perfect solution, and all these solutions need to be properly thought through.
Thanks, Axel. Thanks, Helen. Did you want to? Yep.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that thankfully under the last SB, if I'm not wrong, the terminology about per year, the per year terminology has been taken away. So hopefully it won't come back. And eventually, yeah, the problem probably is permanence and leakages and how to address them, considering not only that human structures are there for sometimes less than, well, 100 years, but eventually we don't have the 100 years to, like, say, let's hope that everything will be fine, and let's see in 100 years or in 50 years if actually those removals worked. So we need something that is really has a sensibility of a few years and may actually estimate what will happen in 100 years. So quite a lot of specific, I'd say, science and really robust. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thanks. Did you want to come in, Malek? Yep.
Just briefly, yeah, I think it's a key issue, and one of the things that we've written about at IETA is the importance of MRV systems that highlight the baseline, the methodology, the mechanism. And I think when we think of carbon dioxide removals, building on what my colleagues have said, it's in that spirit as well.
Thank you, panellists. I think we've probably running up on, oh, we've got one question. All right, very quickly.
Last
please.
question?
Yep,
Okay.
no problem.
I'm Nora from the Global CCS Institute, and this was a very great conversation to have today, so thank you so much for the organizers. Just a comment on the bit about the permanence. From my understanding is the more the CO2 is stored underground, the more stable it is because the physics is on our side. So I'm not sure how that will be taken into account, but of course we do have some background we can use. I think I'm wondering about two things. So one would be the premium, like we're talking about premiums for more permanently stored removals. So how if that would happen, how can we balance that with the less permanent removals, and how do we balance the market in a way that's fair and equitable and etc. Thank you very much.
I'll open that for very lightning responses if anyone wants to come in and. Yeah, Axel.
Yeah, of course, we have certain removal categories that may be inherently permanent. If I look at the Carbfix Climeworks approach in Iceland, which mineralizes in basaltic rock after 2 years and which has been scientifically really checked in a robust manner, then I would say, okay, we may be able to stop monitoring after 5 years. And unless a volcano erupts directly below the site, that is deemed permanent. But anything that relates to biochar, soil carbon, there is so fluffy that we need to have these long-term monitoring approaches, and then all these issues kick in that I described earlier.
Thank you, Axel. Did you want to make any remarks, Helen? Or
Yeah.
Yeah, Vladislav? Yeah. Go.
Yeah, I'll add again that probably also how reversals will be addressed. It's quite important because even if we have, let's say, less robust or less durable removals, depending on how reversals are addressed, it may actually change, because if we have units going down back into the ground for units coming out from the ground, let's say, so something that guarantees the permanence in some way, it may be addressed, but probably need to wait for the methodology when it will be finalized. And I don't know, but it doesn't give a really, let's say, it's not really a comfort thematic, because you're always there with not really sure of what will happen and how negotiators will address it, considering the very large time scales. So we'll see.
Thanks. We'll go to Helen and Malek. Yeah.
I think, back to the point of carbon removals and why it's needed, because it's net zero, it's all forms of carbon removal, and then it's back to the previous points of we need to deal with the issue of what sometimes is called non-permanence or durability, and that needs to be unpacked a bit more. So I think it relates to what Axel was saying on that point. Thank you.
And Malek.
Yeah, I'll make this super quick. So David and I wrote about this last week, and so we can talk afterwards about this exact concept. So thanks for bringing it up.
Thanks, Malek. Look, in closing, and I'm going to hand very shortly to Eman Al-Suwaidi, who is going to make some closing remarks, and she's the team lead for markets for the UAE COP28 presidency. But just to sum up, I do want to thank our panellists for their insightful and generous comments. I also want to thank Sachi for the scene setting and recapping the journey that we've all been on. Sometimes I think we forget, and it's nice to retrace that, and some really interesting data that you presented as well. I'd like to thank IETA, the ICC and the ERCST again. And I just want to recap very briefly on sort of what I've heard. I've heard amplification, next revolution, driving low tech, a tool to achieve something, corks, which must be getting close to that time of the day, consistency, integrity, volcanoes, and I think all in all emphasise that well-designed and high-integrity markets are really essential to scaling and achieving the urgency of the action required. But I will certainly now hand to Eman and let you close our session. Thank you, Eman.
Thank you very much, and I'm not going to hold you for too long, I promise. And first of all, I would love to start this with this, just not within the script. I was really enjoying this moment and this session, and I came and I was so tired because it was a long night yesterday. I was like, I'm exhausted. But once I woke up in here and I was like, wow, this is nice. And I have almost 2-3 pages of notes. So thank you very much. I see familiar faces who it has been a while. So that's good to see you. And I would like to thank you for inviting me to such a very close to my heart topic with such a bright mind and that's always helpful to learn from each other, to spread the word, because what I've also heard from the Article 6 negotiation, it's like there is lack of capacity, because we know that they always say it's always complicated, very technical, and so that perception is there, and on that perception we're adding the perception of the not being integral or not having high integrity. So it's like perception on perception. So this is very important so that we can, create something good. Because I really like how you put it, and I was so happy hearing this from young generation that it's a tool. Yes, it's a tool. And I remember once Simon Steele attended one of the supervisory body meetings, and he was like, for me, the challenge will be if you guys could make an 11-year boy understand what is Article 6. And I was like, yeah, it is a big challenge. We sometimes fall short to understand it, but anyways. Back to the note, closeout note. And many of my things that I wrote as a closeout note, it's relevant, and it somehow will be summarizing what I've heard other than what you've heard, which was more interesting. So we know for a fact, if we just take a step back and we just visualize where we are, we know that we just passed 7 years since the adoption of Paris Agreement. And now we just have 7 years left for the ambition and implementation across mitigation adaptation to year 2030 to achieve our long-term global goals and keep the Paris Agreement within reach. And I know that you're hearing these words a lot, but there is something behind this word. We are not singing. This is something real. So the carbon market and Article 6 mechanism have a critical role to play and a catalyst that supports the importance of delivering this objective. So for us, making this decision on operationalizing Article 6 and carbon markets in high integrity way, it's very important, crucial. I'm not going to go line by line, but bottom line is the strategic use of Article 6 can be a key implementing for a short term, and it will literally, as just was mentioned by the panelists, it will eventually contribute to the net zero. So it's very easy. If I put it simply, how does it relate to the GSTs? We are talking about Article 6, and if we read the Article 6 text, it's right, ambition and DCs. So these things are feeding to the GST. So it is interlinked. So it's all about now for us to focus to, as I just said, to overcome those challenges, the perception, and to make a difference, because these bright minds will make the difference. And when it comes to the COP28 presidency priorities, it's operationalizing Article 6 in the market in a way that it proves that this mechanism is highly responsible, transparent, and is producing high integrity credits. So we can do this. I have high hopes, we can do this. And if I just wrap up, because I don't want to hold you more in the room, it's we want COP28 to be remembered for uniting everyone in action. So one of the action back of my mind is operationalizing Article 6, for example, just for example. And of course, advancing humanity, as for us, it has been always one of the core principles in the United Arab Emirates. And we look forward to welcome you all in COP28 so that you can live that experience with us, create that experience, and bring the change that you would like to see. Thank you very much.